They just drop the kind of headline that's designed to end the conversation before it even starts. Paige Bueckers is making an unprecedented off-court impact. Unprecedented. That word isn't journalism. It's a spell. It's what you say when you want people to nod along, share the post, and move on before anyone asks the one question that matters in sports and in life. Compared to what? Because here's what's happening right now in women's basketball, and anybody with eyes can feel it. The WNBA is finally sitting in the kind of spotlight players have earned for decades. New fans are rushing in. Immigrant families who've always loved the game are watching their daughters see themselves on national TV. People who never felt invited into the old sports world are claiming space anyway. This is not small. This is culture shifting in real time. And in that moment, when the league should be able to tell the truth without flinching, someone decided to roll out a storyline so big, so polished, and so aggressively confident that it instantly triggered the internet's most dangerous reflex, receipts. Because Paige Bueckers is not a random name. She's talented. She's been famous in basketball circles. She's been through adversity, battled injuries, carried expectations, and still walked back into the arena with a calm that screams professional. If this were a conversation about skill, it would be easy. If this were a conversation about potential, it would be exciting. But that's not what they sold. They sold unprecedented impact. And that's a different claim entirely. That's not about jumpers and handles. That's about gravity. That's about who moves crowds, who moves culture, who makes brands sprint instead of stroll. That's about whether the hype is coming from people or being poured on top of them. And if you've been paying attention, you already know why this is exploding. Because the league is in a delicate moment where authenticity is everything. Fans don't just want highlights anymore. They want honesty. They want a sport that respects their intelligence. They want a league that can celebrate multiple stars without trying to override what the public is clearly choosing in real time. That's where the tension lives. On one side, you have a fan base, loud, diverse, unapologetic, that's grown this game with pure love. People who didn't need permission from gatekeepers. People who see women's basketball as bigger than a product. It's community, it's identity, it's proof that excellence doesn't need to look like the old default to be real. On the other side, you have something colder, the machine. The ecosystem of sponsored headlines, pre-packaged narratives, and polished talking points that can make anything sound inevitable until the numbers show up and ruin the fantasy. And the numbers always show up. That's why this page is the next everything. Push has become a flashpoint, not just for basketball fans, but for anyone who's tired of being told what to think by people who assume you won't check. Because if her impact is truly unprecedented, it should be easy to prove without theatrics. It should be visible without forcing it into every sentence. It should feel like the public is dragging the story forward, not like the story is being dragged across the public. So tonight, we're doing what the headlines didn't want you to do. We're slowing down. We're separating talent from marketing. We're separating love for a player from skepticism about a narrative. And we're putting this claim on trial in the only court that matters in modern sports: attention, demand, and receipts. And once you see what happens when we compare unprecedented to the one standard the league can't escape, you'll understand why fans are calling this a hoax, not about Paige, but about the story being built around her. Because the next part is where the whole thing starts to wobble and the people pushing it start to look nervous. Let's talk about why this moment feels so personal to so many people, because it's not just sports discourse. It's not just a debate about who's better, or who deserves a logo, or who got the prettier rollout. This is about something deeper. Who gets to be called the future, and who has to prove they're real every single night. The WNBA is in a rare window right now. You can feel it. The league isn't begging to be noticed anymore. People are noticing. New fans are coming from everywhere. Black communities who have carried the sport for decades. Queer fans who see themselves in the arenas. Immigrant families who know what it means to build something from scratch. And young girls watching with that quiet, electric thought in their chest. That could be me. That kind of growth is fragile. It's also powerful. Because it's not just money. It's legitimacy. It's belonging. And the one thing that can poison that moment faster than anything is the feeling of being managed. Being sold a storyline like you're not smart enough to see it. Being told, here is the star, when the culture is literally screaming, we already picked our stars. That's the tension underneath this Paige narrative. Not that Paige is unworthy. Not that she isn't talented. But that the league and its media ecosystem keep slipping from celebrating her into crowning her, loudly, early, and with language that sounds less like reporting and more like a memo. Because unprecedented off-court impact is not a small phrase. It's a claim that has consequences. If it's true, it rewrites the hierarchy of attention in women's basketball. It reshapes who gets the biggest stages, who gets the prime broadcast slots, who gets the marketing machine behind them, who gets introduced to the mainstream as the face people should care about. And if it's not true, then it's not just sloppy hype. It's manipulation. That's why people are reacting so intensely. Fans are not mad because Paige exists. Fans are mad because the machine is trying to replace organic excitement with a curated substitute. Like we're all supposed to clap on cue and move on. And the reason that hits a nerve in a progressive, immigrant-friendly audience is simple. A lot of us have lived that dynamic outside of sports. We know what it feels like when institutions decide what acceptable success looks like. When the story they want is easier for them to control than the messy, complicated truth of what people are actually responding to. When the narrative rewards whoever fits the comfortable template and punishes whoever disrupts the old order, especially when the disruptor doesn't ask politely. That's where Caitlin Clark enters this as the benchmark, whether anyone likes it or not. Not because she's the only good player in the world. Not because she's the only reason women's basketball matters. But because her rise has been a case study in something institutions can't fully contain: pure, chaotic, fan-driven momentum. You don't have to agree with every piece of the Clark discourse to understand what the league saw. They saw arenas swelling. They saw TV segments leading with her name. They saw the kind of casual fan obsession that women's sports has been denied for generations suddenly erupting in full daylight. That's not a talking point. That's a phenomenon. And here's the part that matters. Phenomena don't need to be declared. They announce themselves. So when you see headlines trying to declare Paige's impact unprecedented, the natural question becomes, why are we hearing it like an announcement instead of seeing it like a reality? Why does it feel like the conclusion is being handed to us before the evidence is even presented? Because if this is truly about growing the league, there's one strategy that always works. Tell the truth about what's happening, then build from there. But if this is about controlling the league's image, about steering attention toward the faces that feel safest, the stories that feel cleanest, the stars that fit the preferred script, then you get something else entirely. Over-promotion, inflated language, and a weird hostility toward anyone who asks for proof. And proof is what fans are asking for. Not to tear Paige down. Not to protect Caitlin. But to protect the league from the exact thing that destroys trust. Messaging that doesn't match lived reality. Because once fans decide you're selling them a mirage, they don't just reject the mirage. They start questioning everything around it. And that's why this is bigger than one headline. Bigger than one sponsorship. Bigger than one player. This is the fight between the people and the machine. Between organic culture and curated control. Between the messy truth of fandom and the neat fiction of a press release. So now, let's do what the headlines didn't do. Let's zoom out, slow down, and establish the only context that matters. What Paige actually is in the ecosystem, what the league wants her to be, and why those two things might not be the same. Because once you see how this narrative got built, you'll recognize the fingerprints everywhere. Here's where the conversation has to grow up, because the easiest way to lose the room is to pretend Paige Bueckers is some made-up player with no resume. That's not only unfair, it's lazy, and it's exactly how serious critiques get dismissed as hate. Paige is real. The talent is real. The poise is real. The story is real. She's been a headline since she was a teenager, and not just because of highlights. Because she carried that rare kind of pressure that young women in sports know too well. Be brilliant. Be perfect. Be marketable. Be humble. Be everything. She played under a microscope. She dealt with injuries that would have broken plenty of careers before they began. And she came back anyway, still smooth, still surgical, still calm. That matters, especially in a league where so many players, including immigrants and first-generation Americans, have had to fight for basic respect while carrying the weight of representation. Paige isn't an enemy of that. She's part of a generation that's watched women's basketball claw for every inch and decided, I'm not apologizing for wanting more. So let's be clear, this is not a takedown of Paige, the athlete. This is a takedown of a sentence. Unprecedented off-court impact. That phrase is not a compliment. It's a comparison. And comparisons come with standards. If someone is truly making an unprecedented off-court impact, you should be able to see it outside of league-approved language. You should be able to feel it in the culture without someone telling you to feel it. It shows up in the way casual fans talk. It shows up in who becomes a reference point in non-sport spaces. It shows up in the kind of demand that forces businesses to adjust plans, not just issue announcements. That's the key difference. Impact doesn't need an introduction. And right now, the league is trying to introduce Paige's impact like it's a product launch. Like it's a campaign. Like it needs a tagline. Which brings us to the uncomfortable truth fans are whispering, and then, lately, saying out loud, the push feels bigger than the pull. Think about how genuine cultural pull actually behaves. It's messy. It's not coordinated. It's not always polite. It doesn't wait for press releases to go live. It hijacks your timeline. It shows up in barbershops, family group chats, immigrant Annie Facebook, TikTok edits, sports radio callers who don't even watch the league but can't stop talking about one player. And when that happens, brands don't just partner. They chase. They scramble. They compete. They overpay. They throw their logo into the storm because the storm is already there. That's why this unprecedented claim is getting heat. Because fans have already seen what undeniable gravity looks like in this exact sport, in this exact era, and it didn't arrive with a neat little headline attached. It erupted. And that eruption has a name, Caitlin Clark. Now, you can respect Paige and still admit that Caitlin has become the clearest modern example of what organic, mass-market attention looks like. Again, that does not make Caitlin morally superior. It doesn't make her the only star worth celebrating. But it does make her the benchmark because she's the rare case where the demand is visible in a way that even skeptics can't ignore. So when Paige gets labeled unprecedented, fans don't hear a compliment. They hear a challenge to their lived experience of this moment. They hear, forget what you saw. Forget what you felt. Forget what you watched happen with your own eyes. We're telling you what's real now. And people, especially people who've had institutions talk down to them their whole lives, do not respond well to that. Immigrant communities know that feeling. Being measured by someone else's rubric. Being told your reality is overstated. Being praised in public but managed in private. Being celebrated only when it's convenient. So when fans sense that same vibe in sports media, when a narrative feels like it's trying to overwrite the audience's perception, it triggers something immediate: distrust. That's why this debate isn't going away. Because the question isn't, is Paige good? She is. The question is Paige already moving the needle in a way that's historically unprecedented, or is the league trying to speak that into existence? And to answer that, we don't need vibes. We need indicators. We need behavior. We need the stuff PR can't fully control. So in the next part, we're putting the unprecedented label up against the coldest judge in sports, the benchmark. The one player whose presence changes venues, ratings, and consumer demand so aggressively that entire organizations have to adjust on the fly. And once we lay those two realities side by side, you'll understand why this headline set off alarms across the entire basketball internet. You can call it unfair. You can call it exhausting. You can call it toxic discourse. But you cannot call it avoidable. The second the league, the sponsors, and the headline writers started using words like unprecedented, they created a benchmark problem. Because in the same breath, they invited the comparison they pretend they don't want. If Paige is unprecedented, then what do we call the player who just bent the entire sports economy of women's basketball around her rival? That's why Caitlin Clark is the control sample in this debate. Not because she's the only one who matters. Not because she's the only one with talent. And definitely not because the WNBA should shrink itself down to one person's story. A league built by Black women, carried by queer athletes, and supported by global fans doesn't belong to one star. Period. But markets don't care about our ideals. Attention doesn't care about our feelings. And impact is one of the few words in sports that can actually be tested. So if you're going to tell the public that Paige has unprecedented off-court impact, you're not just praising her. You're making a measurable claim in the same era where Caitlin's impact has been measurable in the loudest possible way. Here's the simplest way to understand it. There are two kinds of fame. There's basketball fame, the kind that lives inside the sport. Coaches know you. Players respect you. Diehards argue about you. You trend on draft night. That's real. That's earned. That's Paige. And then there's gravity fame, the kind that drags in people who don't even know the rules. The kind that makes your mom's coworker suddenly ask, when do they play? The kind that gets your name said on morning shows that never used to mention women's hoops. The kind that makes the casual fan feel like they're missing history if they don't tune in. That's Caitlin's lane right now. And like it or not, everyone else's impact is being judged against that because she forced the standard into existence. You could feel a shift in the culture. Not in a press release. In the real world. In immigrant households where basketball is already a language, Caitlin became a gateway conversation. Not because she represents every identity in the sport, but because she made it easier for people to pay attention without apologizing. She made it socially normal to care loudly. And when you've spent years watching women's sports get treated like a niche hobby, that kind of normalization matters. It opens doors for everyone else to walk through. That's why this debate gets so heated for progressive audiences. Because there's a truth we can hold at the same time. 1. The league should never be reduced to one player. And 2. When one player creates a mainstream door, the league should be smart enough, humble enough, to admit it and build on it instead of pretending the door appeared by magic. Now, here's where the benchmark becomes uncomfortable. Because Caitlin's impact didn't arrive with a slogan. It arrived with behavior, with evidence, with an ecosystem reacting in real time. When a person has gravity fame, brands don't have to be convinced. They don't need to be nudged. They see the wave and they sprint toward it because capitalism has one religion: momentum. And that momentum shows up in ways you can't fake. You can't fake a game getting moved to a bigger building because demand is too loud to ignore. You can't fake ticket resale prices spiking the minute one name is announced. You can't fake the constant camera cuts, the feverish commentary, the way every sports debate show suddenly turns into, but what about her? Even when the segment wasn't supposed to be about her. You can't fake the way a player becomes a cultural reference point, used as a comparison in other sports, other industries, other conversations about pressure, fame, backlash, and resilience. And most of all, you can't fake what happens when people who never cared before start caring like it's personal. That's Caitlin Clark right now. And it's why fans bristle when they're told someone else's impact is unprecedented. Because it sounds like someone is trying to rewrite a chapter that's still being written in real time. So when Paige gets a shiny rollout, fans don't just see Paige. They see the question the league refuses to answer out loud. Is this real demand, or is this a substitution? Is the league trying to cultivate new stars alongside the wave, or is it trying to redirect the wave towards stars it prefers? That's the villain in this story. Not Paige. Not even any individual executive. It's the instinct to control what should be organic. The impulse to manage fandom instead of respecting it. The fear of letting the culture pick its own heroes. And that's why the phrase unprecedented lands like gasoline. Because in 2026, with the whole world watching women's basketball more closely than ever, fans are done being lectured. They're done being told their eyes are lying. They're done being scolded for reacting to the very thing the league begged for: mainstream attention. If you want a progressive audience to stay with you, you don't gaslight them. You don't shame them. You don't tell them the biggest moment they've witnessed isn't that big. You tell the truth. You honor the moment. And you build. Which brings us to the next question, because this is where the debate stops being philosophical and starts being brutally practical. If Paige's unprecedented impact is real, it should show up where real impact always shows up, in the numbers. And when we get into the logistics, attendance, ratings, venue moves, and what organizations quietly do when demand is undeniable, this story takes a turn that makes the whole narrative feel a lot less like reporting, and a lot more like manufacturing. Here's the part where the conversation gets uncomfortable, because numbers don't care who your favorite player is. Numbers don't care what a headline feels like. Numbers don't care how beautifully a sponsorship post is designed. Numbers just sit there and tell the truth. And in professional sports, there's one truth that outranks all the others. Organizations do not change logistics unless demand forces their hand. Teams don't wake up and say, "You know what would be fun? Let's move this game to a bigger arena. Let's rework staffing. Let's renegotiate building operations. Let's deal with ticketing chaos and security and staffing and concessions." Nobody volunteers for that. It happens because the market is talking too loudly to ignore. So when we talk about impact, this is where we have to look. Not at captions, not at slogans, not at what somebody wants you to believe, but at what franchises, networks, and venues quietly do when they know the building is about to be different. And that's why the Caitlin Clark effect has become the benchmark that everybody is dancing around. Because when Caitlin is in town, the energy changes before tip-off. You see it in the way tickets move. You see it in the way local news suddenly treats the game like a major event. You see it in the way the crowd composition shifts. More kids, more first-time fans, more families, more people who are clearly there because they don't want to miss the moment. It's not just a basketball crowd. It's a cultural crowd. And that kind of crowd forces decisions. Reportedly, we've seen teams move games to larger venues or explore bigger buildings when demand spikes. We've seen broadcast stack coverage and promotional muscle around certain matchups because they know what happens when a true draw shows up. We've seen the league's conversation change from "how do we get people to watch" to "how do we handle the attention we're suddenly getting." That's what real impact does. It creates logistical problems. The good kind. Now let's bring Paige back into this. Not as an insult, but as a test. If Paige has unprecedented off-court impact, the league shouldn't have to tell us. We should be seeing the same kind of external pressure. We should be seeing the same kinds of ripple effects. Ticket demand forcing upgrades, networks fighting for the rights, casual fans showing up in droves, mainstream conversation following her name beyond the core basketball audience. And if you're a fan who's been watching closely, you know why this part is so sensitive, because those signs are not consistently there at the same scale. That doesn't mean Paige has no pull. It doesn't mean she can't grow into that kind of gravity. It doesn't mean she isn't a star in the making. It simply means unprecedented is a heavy word, and heavy words require heavy evidence. And this is where some fans feel the disconnect most sharply. They'll point at games where Paige is present, and the atmosphere is solid, supportive, appreciative, what you want for the league. Then they'll look at the nights when the league's biggest draw is present and see something else entirely: overflow demand, national buzz, people traveling, tickets becoming an event, not just an entry. That contrast is not a moral judgment. It's a market signal. So when the machine tries to smooth that contrast over with one sweeping headline, unprecedented impact, fans read it like an attempt to equalize what hasn't been equalized yet. And you know what happens when audiences feel like they're being equalized? They resist. Especially progressive audiences who have spent their whole lives watching institutions use language to shape perception. We've seen the way systems pick winners and then insist the process was natural. We've seen how narratives are used to manage public emotion. Who deserves praise? Who deserves patience? Who deserves the benefit of the doubt? And we've seen how people get punished for noticing. So when fans insist on comparing attendance, ratings, and venue choices, it's not because they want to reduce women's basketball to capitalism. It's because they want honesty. They want receipts. They want to know the league isn't trying to engineer a reality that hasn't actually arrived. And ratings are where this gets even more revealing. Because one of the cleanest tests in sports is what happens when you remove variables. When a game features multiple stars, the number looks big. Everybody wants credit. But then you watch what happens when one specific star isn't there, and suddenly the viewership doesn't just dip, it changes shape. The conversation quiets. The national attention narrows. Fans have noticed that pattern. Analysts have talked around it. Networks have quietly leaned into it without always saying the name out loud. Because the truth is awkward. Some players add interest, and one player has been acting like the engine. That's not a knock on anyone else. It's just where we are. And here's the part nobody wants to say plainly. If the league is going to grow in a stable way, it can't build trust on spin. It has to build trust on reality. It has to celebrate the stars who are driving attention without resenting them, and it has to develop future faces without pretending they've already arrived at the same destination. Because if you treat the audience like they're dumb, the audience doesn't just leave. They get louder. They start pulling up clips. They start tracking numbers. They start screenshotting contradictions. And that's exactly what's happening now. Because once you accept that logistics are the honest language of demand, one question starts echoing above all the others. If Paige is truly unprecedented, why aren't the logistics screaming it? And in the next part, we're going to move from tickets and buildings to something even more revealing, because this is where the unprecedented narrative really starts to feel staged. We're talking about branding, rollouts, sponsorship optics, and the subtle ways the machine tries to borrow heat from the very phenomenon it refuses to name. This is where the story stops being about basketball and starts being about psychology. Because fans don't just watch games anymore. They watch narratives. They watch marketing. They watch who gets framed as inevitable and who gets framed as still proving it. They watch what the league celebrates loudly, what it whispers, and what it avoids naming at all costs. And if you want to know why this Paige conversation is burning up timelines, it's because the sponsorship optics don't feel like celebration. They feel like strategy. Let's be clear, sponsorships are not evil. Brand deals are not some moral crime. Women athletes deserve every dollar they can get, especially in a sports economy that has underpaid and underestimated them for generations. If you're a progressive fan, you know that supporting women's sports isn't just entertainment, it's a form of economic justice. It's a way of saying talent should be rewarded, full stop. But that's also why fans are so sensitive to how these deals get framed. Because there's a difference between a brand organically chasing a star and a brand participating in a story the league is trying to tell. And when fans say the Paige push feels forced, they're not saying she doesn't deserve deals. They're saying the rollouts feel like they're trying to manufacture a cultural moment instead of reflecting one. Here's what organic looks like in 2026. Organic is chaotic. Organic is brands tripping over each other to associate with the wave. Organic is multiple industries, sportswear, toys, tech, food, finding ways to attach themselves because the demand is already spilling out of the arena and into everyday life. Organic doesn't need heavy narration. It doesn't need the audience to be instructed. It just happens. So when a deal drops and the language around it feels inflated, signature, unprecedented, next face, changing the game, fans immediately run the vibe check. And this is where Paige's sponsorship optics become a lightning rod because the vibe check is not landing clean. Take the toy and family branding lane as an example. On paper, it's smart. It's wholesome. It's cross-generational. It's the kind of category that can turn an athlete into a household name. But in practice, fans are asking a brutal question. Is this deal capturing an existing demand or trying to create one? Because there's a reality about mainstream consumer behavior that marketers understand, even when leaks pretend not to. Casual buyers don't purchase because you tell them someone is a star. They purchase because the star already lives in their head. The star is already part of their family conversation. The star is already the person their kid imitates in the driveway. That's why when people saw Paige positioned as a major off-court force in that space, the reaction split instantly. One side said, "Finally, women athletes getting these kinds of mainstream partnerships." The other side said, Okay, but where's the proof that Paige is the one driving that kind of mass behavior right now? And then the internet did what it always does. It got petty, it got forensic, and it got loud. Fans started analyzing visuals, brand colors, logo choices, the overall polish, the urgency. The way the rollout felt like it was trying to plug Paige into a cultural circuit that another player had already electrified. And that's where the optics got awkward. Because even if the brands involved had zero intention of borrowing anyone's momentum, the audience perception matters. In 2026, the public reads marketing like a language. People notice when a campaign feels like it's echoing another athlete's aesthetic. They notice when the timing feels like a response, not a milestone. They notice when a player is presented as the answer to a question nobody asked yet. And once that perception sets in, you can't PR your way out of it. You can only prove it with real pull. Here's the cold truth. Brands are not charities. If a deal is purely business, it should show business results. It should show demand. It should show that the athlete can move product, move attention, move culture. When those results aren't visible, fans start suspecting the other motive, signaling. Not signaling in the cheap way people throw that word around, but signaling as in, this partnership is designed to communicate who the league wants centered, who it wants associated with the future, and who it wants the audience to get comfortable with as the chosen face. And that's where the villain energy creeps in. Because there's something deeply disrespectful about a system that tries to manage fandom like a classroom. It's the same disrespect immigrant communities have felt when institutions celebrate diversity, while still deciding which stories are safe enough to elevate. It's the same feeling queer fans get when they're welcomed as a marketing demographic, but ignored as a cultural force. It's the same feeling Black women athletes have known forever, praised in slogans, policed in reality. So when fans see rollouts that feel like corporate choreography, headline first, proof later, they don't just criticize the marketing. They see a power move. They see an attempt to crown a star through repetition instead of resonance. And that's why Paige is getting dragged into this storm. Not because she asked to be the centerpiece of a narrative war, but because the machine picked her as a vehicle. Which is tragic because it puts her in a position where every partnership becomes a referendum. Every logo becomes an argument. Every wholesome brand moment becomes a battlefield. And the worst part is, none of this is necessary. If Paige is going to be that level of star, she can become it the honest way, through moments, through games, through undeniable gravity. Let her build it. Let the fans fall in love in real time. Let the culture decide without being steered. Because the second you try to steer it, you create backlash. And backlash spreads faster than any sponsored headline ever could. And now that backlash has a target, not Paige, but the echo chamber that keeps repeating unprecedented like it's a fact. Because in the next part, we're going to expose how that echo chamber works. How one talking point becomes 5 segments, how 5 segments become consensus, and how consensus becomes a weapon used to shame fans who simply ask for receipts. And once you see that pipeline, you'll never hear these headlines the same way again. Here's the part that makes people feel like they're losing their minds. Because you'll scroll your phone and see it in one place. Paige's impact is unprecedented. Then you'll turn on a show and hear it again, dressed up in different clothes. You can't deny what she's doing off the court. Then you'll open a sports app and read a third version. The league is already rallying around its next centerpiece. And by the time you've heard it for the 5th time, it stops sounding like an opinion. It starts sounding like a fact. That's how the echo chamber works. Not by proving something, by repeating it until people are tired of arguing. This is what I call talking point inflation, when a claim gets pumped so aggressively that the language becomes bigger than the evidence. Rising becomes unstoppable. Popular becomes unmatched. Promising becomes unprecedented. And suddenly, if you question it, you're not just disagreeing. You're hating. You're anti-growth. You're against women's sports. That's the trick. Turn a marketing statement into a moral test. And progressive audiences see this immediately because we've seen the same tactic everywhere else. Institutions love to wrap narratives in virtue, so you won't challenge them. They'll tell you the story is about empowerment, while quietly deciding who gets empowered. They'll tell you criticism is harm, while using that shield to protect their own control. So when fans push back on the Paige hype machine, it isn't because they don't want Paige to succeed. It's because they recognize the structure. They recognize the choreography. They recognize a message being pushed from the top down and amplified through the same few channels until it feels like reality. And what makes it messy is that the echo chamber isn't one villain in a dark room. It's a system of incentives. Beat writers need access. Networks need storylines. Sponsors need clean heroes. Social media pages need engagement. And the easiest content in sports is not analysis. It's certainty. Certainty gets clicks. Certainty gets shares. Certainty gets people yelling in the comments. So a headline drops, and instead of asking, "Is this true?" the ecosystem asks, "Can we build on this?" One tweet becomes a segment. One segment becomes a panel debate. One panel debate becomes a clip. One clip becomes a reaction video. A reaction video becomes a quote graphic. The quote graphic becomes a trend. And now, without anyone ever showing you evidence, you're being told there's no debate. Meanwhile, if you're the fan at home watching the games, something feels off. Because you're not against Paige. You're just not seeing the same thing the headlines keep insisting is happening. And that disconnect is where mistrust grows. You can feel it in the way WNBA Twitter splits into tribes overnight. You can feel it in the way comment sections become less about basketball and more about loyalty tests. You can feel it when fans who love the sport start sounding like political analysts because they don't trust the messaging. Because once the media ecosystem starts telling you what you must believe, it stops being fun. It starts feeling like control. And here's where the drama gets real. The echo chamber doesn't just hype players. It also decides who gets framed as a problem. This is the part nobody likes to say out loud, but everybody sees. When certain stars become too big, too messy, too uncontrollable, the coverage shifts. The language changes. Suddenly the player isn't a phenomenon. She's polarizing. She isn't drawing crowds. She's bringing unwanted attention. She isn't competitive. She's arrogant. She isn't getting fouled. She's complaining. And if you're a progressive fan, you know that language game. You've watched it happen to outspoken women in every industry. You've watched it happen to immigrants who don't perform gratitude the right way. You've watched it happen to Black women who are brilliant but refuse to shrink. You've watched it happen to queer people who won't soften themselves to be palatable. So when a transcendent star doesn't fit the preferred script, the echo chamber doesn't always attack directly. It reframes. It drains empathy. It redirects attention. And that's why this Paige narrative is colliding with the Caitlyn narrative like a car crash in slow motion. Because one story is being treated like an official campaign, polished, approved, repeated, protected. And the other story is chaotic, massive, unavoidable, and most importantly, owned by the fans. That's why the tension feels so raw. It's not really Paige versus Caitlyn. It's people versus messaging. It's public reality versus curated reality. And the scariest part for the machine is this: the public is learning how it works. Fans are comparing headlines to box scores. They're comparing sponsorship language to ratings data. They're comparing primetime promotion to who actually sells out buildings. They're noticing what gets celebrated, what gets ignored, and what gets spun. They're doing media literacy in real time, and that is the one thing no echo chamber survives. Because once fans can see the pipeline, repetition stops working. The spell breaks. And when the spell breaks, all that's left is the question the headlines tried to outrun from the very beginning. If this is real momentum, why does it need so much help? In the next part, we're going to take that question straight into the heart of the issue, because the turning point in this story isn't about one player's talent. It's about why certain institutions keep trying to pre-select the future instead of letting the future happen. If you want to know the exact moment a narrative starts to crack, it's not when a hater tweets. It's not when a rival fan base gets loud. It's when neutral people who don't have a dog in the fight, start saying the same sentence in different ways. Why are they trying so hard? That's the question sitting underneath this entire page, storyline like a pressure plate. Because real momentum doesn't require this much narration. Real cultural pull doesn't need a chaperone. Real impact doesn't need to be defended like it's fragile. And when you see something being protected, the first instinct isn't celebration. It's suspicion. So let's follow the logic all the way through. If Paige Bueckers is truly making an unprecedented off-court impact, then the story should be self-propelling. It should be messy and loud and impossible to contain. Fans should be dragging it across platforms without being asked. Sponsors should be escalating in a way that looks competitive, not coordinated. Media coverage should feel reactive, not rehearsed. Instead, what a lot of people feel is orchestration. And orchestration is not always evil. Sometimes it's just business. Sometimes it's a league trying to be smarter than it used to be. Sometimes it's executives finally realizing that women's basketball deserves the same marketing muscle men's leagues have used forever. But here's where orchestration turns into overreach, when it starts trying to replace the audience's choice with the institution's preference. That's when it becomes a power story, because the WNBA isn't just a league. It's a symbol. It's been a home for players who never got treated like the default in American sports culture. It's been built by women who were told their dreams were niche. It's been sustained by communities that know what it means to fight for visibility. So when fans sense that the league is trying to manage who gets the spotlight, it hits a nerve that goes beyond basketball. It triggers a familiar feeling, being curated. Immigrant communities know this. Being welcomed, but only on certain terms. Being praised, but only if you fit the story people are comfortable telling. Being allowed into the room, but not allowed to move the furniture. That's what help needed really implies. It implies that the league doesn't trust the public to decide. It implies that the league thinks it has to steer you away from the messy, uncontrolled phenomenon and toward the safer, approved option. And once fans believe that, everything changes. Because now it's not about Paige's game. It's about the machine's motives. So what are the motives? Let's not do conspiracy fan fiction. Let's do incentives, because incentives are how power actually operates. The league wants stability. Brands want predictability. Media wants clean arcs. And nothing is cleaner than a pre-selected hero with a well-managed image, a polished storyline, and a controlled rollout. A star you can sell without worrying she'll overpower the entire conversation in ways you can't script. But what happens when the real star, the one generating chaos-level attention, doesn't fit the preferred script? You try to contain her. You don't have to ban her. You don't have to say it out loud. You just tilt the framing. You amplify different faces. You celebrate other narratives as the future. You keep repeating, it's bigger than one player, in moments where what you really mean is, please stop making it about the player we can't control. And that's the turning point in the story, the realization that the fight isn't Paige versus Caitlyn. It's control versus reality. Because reality is rude. Reality doesn't care what a league office wants. Reality doesn't care what a sponsor deck says. Reality is what happens when a player walks into a building and the building changes. And when a league tries to redirect that kind of reality instead of harnessing it, it creates a backlash that no amount of marketing can smooth over. This is why fans are sharpening their media literacy. They're not just watching highlights. They're watching how narratives get built. They're noticing patterns. Who gets the prime slots? Who gets the flattering language? Who gets protected when things go sideways? Who gets framed as problematic when they're simply powerful? And that's where the progressive audience is especially unforgiving, because we've seen what happens when systems decide which kinds of power are acceptable. We're told to support women's sports, but only the women who are palatable. We're told to celebrate growth, but only the growth that stays on script. We're told to love the league, but not to question the league. And fans are finally saying no. We can love the sport and still demand honesty. We can celebrate multiple stars and still reject propaganda language. We can respect Paige's talent and still call out a machine that's trying to inflate a storyline into a reality. Because here's the truth. If Paige becomes that level of cultural force, she won't need this kind of protection. The public will do it for her. The numbers will do it for her. The moments will do it for her. And if she isn't there yet, that's not a failure. That's just time. That's development. That's the natural arc of stardom. The only thing that becomes a failure is trying to skip the arc and bully the audience into believing the ending before the middle has even happened. And now that the audience has named the question, why does this need so much help? There's no going back. Because once people start asking that, they don't stop. They start rewatching. They start rereading. They start pulling threads. And in the next part, we're going to pull the biggest thread of all. Because the most explosive reveal isn't in the headlines. It's in the moment the league tries to clean up the narrative and accidentally exposes how the whole machine really operates. Here's the cleanest way to say it without playing the internet's favorite game of cruelty. Paige Bueckers is not the hoax. The hoax is the spin. And if you care about this league, if you care about women athletes getting paid, getting respected, and getting treated like real pros, you should want that distinction to be crystal clear. Because the quickest way to poison a sport's growth is to turn every conversation into a purity test, where you either worship the narrative or you're labeled a villain. That's not fandom. That's conditioning. Paige is a real player with real skill. She doesn't need to be protected from honest questions, and she definitely doesn't need to be used as a shield for league messaging. If anything, the most respectful thing you can do for a young star is tell the truth about where she is and give her room to become what she can become. Because stardom is not a title you receive. It's a relationship you build. And when people say this feels manufactured, they're not saying Paige is fake. They're saying the language around Paige is doing too much. It's like watching someone pour gasoline on a candle and then acting surprised when the room fills with smoke. Unprecedented is gasoline. Unmatched is gasoline. Next face of the league is gasoline. Not because Paige can't become huge, but because those words are trying to skip the part that makes stars feel real, the organic middle. The struggle, the moments, the public choosing you without being ordered to. That's what the machine keeps underestimating about fans, especially progressive audiences who are tired of being talked down to. We can handle nuance. We can hold multiple truths at once. We can say Paige is elite and still reject propaganda phrasing. We can celebrate her endorsements and still ask whether the league is trying to steer attention away from the player who is currently dragging the entire sport into mainstream conversation. We can support the WNBA and still demand that it respects us enough to stop pretending. And here's why that matters. Because the league doesn't need less honesty right now. It needs more. The WNBA has a chance to be a model for what modern American sports can look like. Diverse, global, immigrant welcoming, queer forward, unapologetically excellent. A place where different styles of greatness can coexist. A place where the story is big enough for more than one hero. But you don't get that future by forcing a script. You get it by letting reality breathe. If Caitlyn is the gravity star right now, say that and build around it. If Paige is the next wave, nurture it and let it crest naturally. If other stars are carrying the league every night in ways the mainstream still ignores, elevate them without needing to downplay anyone else. That's not just good values. That's good business. And more importantly, it's good culture. Because people don't share what feels staged. They share what feels true. They share the moment a rookie silences a hostile crowd. They share the clip where a veteran stands up for a teammate. They share the post-game interview where a player speaks like she's carrying her entire community on her back. They share authenticity, especially immigrant communities who know the difference between a story told from the inside and a story packaged for approval. So yes, let's retire the lazy framing. Paige isn't the fraud. The fraud is the idea that you can declare impact into existence and then shame fans for noticing the gap. The fraud is pretending a headline is the same thing as a movement. The fraud is asking the audience to accept a conclusion that the evidence hasn't earned yet. And if the league wants to protect itself, it should stop trying to protect the narrative. Protect the players. Protect the integrity. Protect the trust. Because trust is the only currency that lasts longer than hype. And right now, the trust is being tested. Not by Paige, not by fans who ask questions, but by the machine that keeps pushing certainty where honesty would do more good. So the real challenge moving forward isn't whether Paige can be a star. She can. The challenge is whether the WNBA and its media partners can handle an era where fans don't just watch the product, they analyze the messaging. They compare the receipts. They call out the spin. And once the audience starts doing that, there's only one way to win them back. You stop performing. You start telling the truth. Because what happens next will decide whether this league rides its biggest wave into something permanent or lets the wave crash into a wall of avoidable backlash. So now we're here, at the point where the story isn't really about Paige Bueckers or Caitlin Clark as individual human beings. It's about what kind of league the WNBA wants to be in the era it's been fighting for. Because this is the moment women's basketball has dreamed of. Packed arenas, national debate, mainstream attention, cultural relevance. And yes, messiness. That's part of it too. Big sports are messy because big sports are alive. People argue because they care. People fight over narratives because narratives shape who gets opportunity, who gets paid, who gets protected, who gets remembered. And if you're an immigrant family, if you're a first-generation kid, if you've ever felt like you had to earn your seat twice just to get half the respect, then you already understand the core lesson of this whole controversy. You cannot manufacture belonging. Belonging is chosen. That's why fans are pushing back. Not because they hate Paige, not because they worship Caitlin, but because they want the league to respect the most powerful thing it finally has, an audience that's awake, an audience that checks the receipts, an audience that can celebrate multiple stars without being manipulated into pretending the playing field is something it isn't, an audience that can hold pride and critique at the same time. That's the future. And it's a beautiful one if the league stops trying to manage it like a brand and starts honoring it like a community. Because here's what's true: no matter what side you're on, the WNBA does not need to pick a single face. It needs to stop pretending the public didn't already pick who's driving the biggest wave right now. And it needs to stop using inflated language as a shortcut. Say Paige is a star. That's fair. Say Paige has major potential. That's true. Say Paige is positioned for big deals. Absolutely. But don't call it unprecedented and then act shocked when the public asks for the evidence.